dass man von uns verlangt hat, zu schwören, für Führer, Volk und Vaterland, wenn es notwendig ist, also auch das Leben zu opfern, das fanden wir eigentlich selbstverständlich.
By the end of the war, the morale of the German army was crushed. Everyone seemed to know that the Reich was coming to an end. But there was a group of citizens who did not share this mentality. The Hitler Youth was made up of children and teenagers, in some cases far from the age of majority. But what they lacked in experience, they made up for in fanaticism. They had been indoctrinated from a young age to superimpose the ideas of the Nazi Party over even their own lives, and they had become the staunchest defenders of the Reich. This included committing terrible brutalities. So it was that the Allies were ordered to treat these young people like any other fighter and to have no room for mercy. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about how the Hitler Youth killed and died. By 1944, German troops were in full retreat. The territory of Eastern Europe conquered in the previous 3 years was quickly liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies were planning their landing in Normandy. The immense number of casualties suffered on the Eastern Front had exhausted the Nazi forces, both in equipment and men. As their enemies drew ever closer to Berlin, Hitler made the drastic decision to turn to another sector of the population, the boys and girls of the Third Reich. These members of the Hitler Youth had already been involved in the war, but their tasks, up to that point, had been in support. The work that the Nazi leaders had in mind for them now was much more dangerous. These miners would form combat divisions and be sent to the front to fight fiercely against the invaders. First, those close to adulthood, 18 or 17 years old, were used. But it was not long before children of 14 or even younger were forced to kill and die for their country. The first few times the Allies and Soviets encountered these youth brigades, some soldiers hesitated before pulling the trigger. But in many cases, the Germans did not. Several of these teenagers were complete fanatics, willing to take part in suicide missions to annihilate the enemy. This led, as we mentioned at the beginning, to the military leaders of the invaders, giving strict orders to treat members of the Hitler Youth like any other Nazi fighter. They were victims of indoctrination, but nothing could be done for them. There was no room for any kind of mercy on the battlefield. Those who did not fall on the front could be tried and executed, regardless of their young age. This was the case, for example, with Heinz Petri and Josef Schoner, aged 16 and 17.
Under interrogation, Petri, the 16-year-old, admitted being a spy. They were then imprisoned in Aachen prison. There was a day-long hearing in front of a US military court, made up of members of the 9th Army, and the pair, despite their age, were sentenced to death by firing squad on the 29th of March 1945 in a court-martial in Mönchengladbach for committing acts of espionage which were damaging to the war effort. The jury of officers came up with a 2/3 majority, and the death sentences were carried out to show the German people how serious the Americans were to remove the poisonous breath of German militarism and Nazi ideology from the face of the earth completely.
Worse still, some of these divisions were part of the SS, the most important paramilitary organization in Nazi Germany. They were responsible for the worst brutalities on both the Eastern and Western fronts. And, whether by force or with pleasure, in many cases these young people also took part in these war crimes. There are known cases in which prisoners were summarily shot by members of the Hitler Youth, supposedly without the slightest sign of remorse. If a member of this group fell into Soviet hands, he knew that his life was over. Being a minor was no excuse. From the time they entered into action until the end of the war, thousands of boys and girls were killed in combat or executed. But how did this force begin to form, so in line with National Socialist doctrine, so much so that it could even surpass that of much older men? How did such a level of blind fanaticism come about? The Hitler Youth Organization was created in 1922, 2 years after the origin of the Nazi Party, under the name of the Youth League. Its purpose was to train and recruit future members of the SA, the Storm Section, the main paramilitary group before the SS took more power. Clearly, only the Aryan population was allowed to join. From the age of 10 and until they reached the age of majority, children affiliated with this group were indoctrinated in the policies and ideologies of the party. By 1930, under the name by which it would be known during the war, the organization had about 25,000 members, and the following year, it became officially part of the SA. In 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, the Hitler Youth had an incredible increase in its membership, having almost 2.5 million children in its ranks. But it was not only because of the people who signed up. In many cases, they absorbed other youth organizations, sometimes by force. They became the only association for minors in the country, while their numbers grew exponentially. Children who were not members were harassed by various sectors of society. They were mocked by students and teachers alike, and might not receive their graduation diploma, which also kept them from studying at university. Employers had the right to reject them as apprentices, and they were excluded from sports teams. All of these factors created immense pressure to join the organization. However, in 1939, just months before the start of World War II, conscription became mandatory. Parents who refused to enlist their sons and daughters were investigated by the authorities and often arrested. The Nazi leaders saw members of the Hitler Youth as representatives of the Aryan future of the Reich, and so the ideology of the party was taught to them as soon as they joined. Weekly meetings were held where the older members read Nazi texts to the younger members. Among them was Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, the book written by Adolf Hitler himself. It was not long before ideas of racial superiority over Jews and Slavs were engraved in the young minds. They were also taught the uselessness of Christianity and the church, and they even organized to speak at meetings of these groups. Above all, the idea that the Reich must survive, even if it meant their deaths, was repeated ad nauseum. As war approached, military training began to be added to the curriculum. Common weapons and their use were taught, as well as basic combat tactics and strategies. Physical ability began to take precedence over academics. These young men were gradually molded into fanatical soldiers, willing to die for the Führer and the 1,000-year Reich. Although not all members shared this fervor for the party, the harassment they suffered from the most indoctrinated kept them silent and remained part of the organization. World War II began on September 1, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Not long after this event, it was decided that the Hitler Youth should become fully involved in the country's war effort. By the following year, these teenagers were already part of the German postal and railway services. When the Allies began their bombing raids on German territory, they were assigned to relief tasks, such as in fire brigades. For now, the only direct combat they participated in was as crews of anti-aircraft divisions, protecting cities from enemy aircraft, as we can hear below.
Leistungen kann ich kaum beschreiben. Es kam ein Luftwaffenoffizier zu uns in den Unterricht und verkündete uns, dass die Jahrgänge 26 und 27 dieser bestimmten Klassen der höheren Schulen mit dem 10. oder 15. Februar 1943 zur Flak kämen als Luftwaffenhelfer. Wir sind alle aufgesprungen, haben gejubelt, es war ein ohrenbetäubender Lärm. Und nun, auf einen Schlag, wurden wir Soldaten, ehe wir es gehofft hatten. Nur Freude.
But this limited exposure to action was about to change dramatically. By 1942, the war had dragged on longer than Nazi leaders had expected. Setbacks in the North African campaign, plus the serious complication of the advance on the Eastern Front, meant the loss of large numbers of men for the Germans. So some high-ranking officers, such as SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, began to consider members of the youth as military reserves. In early 1943, Hitler approved the creation of a combat division made up entirely of members of the organization, aged 17 or 18. Their training soon began, where the ideas of cruelty and sacrifice learned in the previous years were put into practice. By 1944, their training was complete. Party leaders were impressed by the bravery and high morale displayed by its members and by the enthusiasm with which they expressed their ideology. it was decided that their baptism of fire would be in one of the most famous and bloodiest operations of the entire conflict, the Normandy landings. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded the French coast. It was here that the new division first encountered its enemy, made up mostly of British and Canadian soldiers. The bravery and courage of the children and teenagers astonished the invaders, throwing themselves fearlessly upon the tanks and destroying 28 of them. But the Allies' superior training and tactics soon proved too much for the young Nazis. Before the assault on the beaches was over, they had lost 3,000 soldiers. By the first month of fighting, the division had suffered 60% casualties, killed and wounded. Soon, their high morale had plummeted, and they were faced head-on with the reality of war, as one former member recounts below.
Ich hatte 4 Freunde, mit denen wir hingegangen sind. Das waren wirklich Freunde, also nicht nur so Soldaten, sondern wir waren Freunde. Und von denen sind innerhalb von 14 Tagen oder 3 Wochen sind 3 Mann gefahren. Also das war da ziemlich hart und dann fühlt man sich als Kanonenfutter. Ne?
Even so, they continued to fight against the Western powers with ferocity. But this was not the only front Germany had to deal with. After their famous defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans had been beaten back, closely pursued by the Soviet Red Army. To make up for the numerous losses, the Hitler Youth began recruiting boys and girls of increasingly younger age. It was not unusual to see 14-year-old fighters, while those of 10 or 12 played support roles. The Russians, however, did not usually pay attention to this. From the beginning of their offensive, they were dominated by their thirst for revenge, wanting to repay the Nazis for the brutalities suffered on their territory. There were cases where, when a young member of these organizations fell into Soviet hands, the soldiers would give him just one blow and send him to his mother. But on many other occasions, his treatment was no different than that of any other prisoner of war. Large numbers of children were sent to forced labor camps and many died there. By 1945, war had come to Germany and the Nazis were desperate. For Hitler, the time had come for total war. There were no more civilians, only combatants. To confront their enemies, they were forced to draw on the last reserves of the population they had left. In addition to the German line army, a militia known as the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, was formed. It was made up of every male, aged 16 to 60, who had not yet been drafted into the country's armed forces. If anyone refused, he was arrested or executed by SS soldiers. Many members of the Hitler Youth were added to these divisions, which were placed under the command of the most fanatical officers in the Reich. They needed this kind of blind loyalty for the missions they were sent on. Typically, they were given anti-tank weapons and ordered to hide until the armored vehicles passed by. At that point, they would attack and destroy the vehicle. Some US soldiers reported encountering children as young as 8 years old, armed and waiting for their enemies. Listen to one of these child soldiers in the video below.
So sind wir also am 4. April 1945 gemustert worden. Ein Teil meiner Klasse wurde tauglich gemustert und wir kriegten dann auch die Tarnanzüge der Waffen-SS. Natürlich war das für mich so, man musste die Ärmel und die Beine hochkrempeln. Ich war 1,60 Meter, also so kleine Tarnanzüge waren offenbar selten.
Many other members were trained to serve as spies and saboteurs. This operation became known as Werwolf. It was not only children who took part in these actions, although they formed a large part of their ranks. They had been ordered to carry out guerrilla actions to sow chaos behind enemy lines. But the disorder that characterized German plans at this time of the war, coupled with poor training, resulted in the frequent failure of these attacks. There were numerous cases where, despite being minors, captured werewolves were shot by the Allies, accused of espionage, as in the aforementioned case of Petri. But as could be expected, these new forces made up of young and old had no effect on the enemy advance. The Soviets continued to rapidly approach the capital. During the Battle of Berlin, the militias formed an integral part of the city's defense. they were reported to have fought with much greater fervor than the veteran officers and soldiers of the German army, perhaps because the latter already saw that defeat was certain. On numerous occasions, even when completely surrounded, the young men fought to the death of the last member rather than surrender. There were even cases where they took their own lives before being taken prisoner. That was the extent of their indoctrination. In the last days of the war, to avoid unnecessary deaths, Helmuth Weidling, the general in charge of the defense of Berlin, ordered the youth combat divisions to disband. But in the chaos of this battle, the directive was never carried out, and these miners continued to die in droves until the German capitulation. The forces of the Third Reich signed their surrender on May 8, 1945. Immediately after this, with the country occupied by the Allies and the Soviets, the process of denazification began. This movement sought to eliminate all traces of the ideology and politics of the National Socialist Party from local culture. The Hitler Youth was affected by this movement, and the group was banned. Although there was evidence that some of its members had committed war crimes, due to their young age, they were not tried for them. Likewise, some adult leaders of the organization were sentenced to prison, and other members of the organization, as we saw in previous cases, suffered criminal sanctions for other types of crimes. Extermination camps. The aim was to confront them with the most terrible crimes committed by their party, and to make them aware of the actions they helped carry out. On the other hand, compulsory education, which had been replaced by youth meetings, was put back into effect. It was not unusual to see 16 or 17-year-old boys with very poor reading or writing skills, as military actions had become more important than their academic training. There were cases where indoctrination had been too effective, and even after the war was over, boys and girls continued to clamor for National Socialism. But on many other occasions, these young people were able to realize that the party had stolen their childhood. Several former members became great whistleblowers, charged with raising awareness in the world about the crimes in which they had participated.
The full name is Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz. And I remember on September the 1st, 1939, Hitler was on the radio telling that the war started. Since 5 o'clock this morning, our troops marching into Poland, doing whatever they do best. 6 months later, Hitler marched into the France. The British came and the Americans came into the war. And I talked to my grandpa, and he told me, he said, if they want to win the war, it don't look too good. He said, don't say that, Grandpa, we cannot lose the war. That was not even remotely in my mind that we ever could lose a war, you know, because we were so conditioned politically. Hitler controlled the newspapers, they controlled the radio, and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, he controlled everything else. And we listened to the news, and they told us all about going on the Western Front and how successful they are and all that. And then we walked outside and we heard the guns.
What you just heard are the memoirs of Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz, a Nazi pilot of the Luftwaffe who fought in World War II under the command of Adolf Hitler. Have you ever wondered what it must have felt like to be a German soldier in the 1940s? In this new video from Military History, we invite you to step fully into the shoes of the German combatants. Get ready to discover a hidden side of the greatest conflict of the 20th century like you've never seen before. Technology allows us to access the memories of this German man, born on October 11, 1927, in Milrath. By the time the German operation in Polish territory began, Schmitz was only 12 years old. He was still an impressionable child, marked by a lifetime of National Socialist education. Keep in mind that since the 1930s, the front led by Adolf Hitler was the hegemonic force within Germany. As Gert recalls, they had control of all media channels. From there, they formed a harsh opinion within the populace.
They had everything organized. You couldn't get lost or fall through the crack. You know, there were no cracks. You were part of it if you liked it or not. I got drafted into the Hitler Youth when I was 10 years old. And they gave us a uniform and all that, you know.
The Hitler Youth was a central element within the doctrine of the Third Reich. They were indoctrination groups established by the National Socialist Party in 1922, aimed at creating a new educational system for young Germans. From a young age, they were provided with military training and encouraged to develop an understanding of Nazi ideology. Among their principles were racism, nationalism, physical activity, camaraderie, outdoor life, invocation of blood purity, and honor. The ultimate goal was to train the leaders of the future. In 1923, this organization had around 1,000 members. 4 years later, the figure multiplied by 5. By 1930, there were already 25,000 boys, while at the time of Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1934, attendance increased exponentially. Documents speak of more than 300,000 young people affiliated with this indoctrination group. Among them was Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz. Once he completed his initial stint with the Hitler Youth, the boy received a seductive offer from the most prestigious force in all of Germany, the Luftwaffe, the feared air force of the Reich.
They said, do you want to go to a jet pilot training school? We have one in Fulda, Germany. And you go over there and you start training for a flying Messerschmitt 262 jets. He says, shoot, yeah. And when I got up there, the hangars were bombed, the runways were bombed, the airplanes were bombed. And there was nothing left for us to do. And they said, well, we'll temporarily assign you to a paratrooper outfit and send you to the Western Front.
That's how Schmitz ended up fighting on the bloody Eastern Front, more precisely in the German city of Pasewalk. In that region of Europe, the Axis faced almost exclusively the Soviet Union and its allies, resulting in particularly bloody battles due to the pre-existing hatred between those peoples. Many experts claim that the Eastern Front was the most decisive in defining the German defeat, accounting for at least 70% of the fallen soldiers of the Third Reich. And it was to that terrible zone that Schmitz was sent as a young graduate of the Hitler Youth.
We talked to the people, the local people there. They heard on the news that the Russians had just come from the south, from the east and south, and cut off that air base where we were. And that was bad news.
Gert managed to escape from the Russians. Being captured by the Red Army would have meant brutal torture, and in many cases, death after a long stay in detention centers. The problem was that in his retreat, he dangerously approached British and American troops, which outnumbered the German ones. By 1945, the outcome of the war was apparent. It was only a matter of time before the defeat of the Third Reich was sealed. Even a young soldier like Schmitz could perceive the disorganization and problems facing Hitler's armed forces.
There was an open field and they wanted to march into the woods. And what we were way behind as a rear guard, they walked into a trap. The Americans, they already were on 3 sides when they waited till the whole battalion marched in there and they mowed them down. So the 4 of us, we went off to the right into the woods and disappeared in the woods. And that's how we ended up behind enemy lines.
Along with his 3 companions, Gert fled from the Allied checkpoints that were gradually dominating all the routes and roads of Germany. In silence and starving, they reached Dülmen. They arrived in the city during the day. The area looked peaceful, almost like an oasis amidst so much violence.
They said, well, that must be a park. Nobody is fighting in the park, so we're going to be pretty safe. So we got over and climbed over that 6-foot fence. GIs walking all over the place there. And they saw us and they started shooting at us. They had a 2.5 truck with machine guns on there. They came around and started shooting at us with that. And then we said, we got to get out of this park. So we jumped over the fence. Then there was tanks on the outside. They said, that ain't not safe either. Let's jump back in the fence. We jumped back over that 6-foot fence. And then that truck came and started shooting at us. We went back over the fence again and went in the other direction. And we saw a pine forest over there. And they said, let's get into that forest and get the heck out of here.
The situation was worrying. Surrounded by hundreds of heavily armed Allied troops, the 4 Germans only found refuge behind the pines. It was only a matter of time before they were caught, presenting a new problem. How to surrender peacefully without triggering a shootout in which they would likely be killed. The protagonist of this story found a rather curious solution.
And they came and I stood behind a tree. You know, we all stood behind each one of those trees. It was just big enough to hide us. And they said, what I'm gonna do, you know, if we can't run, they're gonna start shooting at us. And I finally, I put my hand out and waved, you know, say, hi. And they said, come on out, you know, hands up, hands up. And that's how we got captured.
Already under American custody and awaiting transfer to a prisoner of war camp in the United States, Gert began a long journey across Europe. He was constantly relocated as the Allies pacified different war zones. According to his own words, he spent most of his time drawing to depict the experiences he lived as a prisoner. After several months, Germany finally surrendered. The war ended, and many captured soldiers, those of lower rank who hadn't committed provable crimes, were sent home. But that home no longer existed. Now Germany was a destroyed wasteland, ravaged by bombing campaigns and with virtually no industry. After years of hardship as his country recovered from devastation, in 1952, Gert decided to journey to the United States, where he began a new life. There, he served in Uncle Sam's army and even participated as an aerospace engineer alongside renowned specialists in the field. Schmitz was a key member of the space program, holding several patents in his name. Additionally, he was a founding member of the von Braun Astronomical Society. Schmitz often recalled his childhood in Germany, both the good and the bad. Family moments and days of hunger and war marked his generation. Gert enjoyed recounting these memories. It was the best way to keep the memory of his parents and grandparents alive. Throughout this video, we saw one of his last interviews, in which he compiled much of his service for the Third Reich and the way he was captured by the Allies. Beyond all the death and violence that inhabit his story, his narrative closes with a reflection as simple as it is true.
War is the stupidest thing that man invented. If you can't talk it out, if you cannot communicate, you start fighting. You have to do away with your problem. You have to annihilate your problem. But that is not a solution. Yeah, that just creates more problems.
Testimonies like that of Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz are essential for understanding in depth the functioning of the institutions of the Third Reich, as well as the human factor that composed those forces. Let's take, for example, the aforementioned Luftwaffe, one of the great pillars of the German offensive during World War II. After assuming power in Germany in 1933, the first thing Adolf Hitler did was to secretly begin developing his military air force. Remember that after the defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles severely limited German military development, but the National Socialist leader had no intention of obeying those terms. after several moves to organize his troops. On February 26, 1935, the top Nazi ordered his air minister, Hermann Göring, to formally rebuild the German aviation. This new war instrument was presented to the world in March of that same year. The growth was surprising. Thousands of pilots were quickly incorporated, and air bases were opened throughout German soil. There, the future airmen of the Third Reich were trained. The Luftwaffe, through the country's main aeronautical companies, designed and built thousands of aircraft at an average rate of almost 15,000 units per year. In total, before and during World War II, German industries built nearly 86,000 aircraft of all shapes, modalities, and uses. Precisely, one of the most significant changes brought about by the Second Global Conflict was the full integration of aviation into the war world. Although during World War I the use of aircraft had been more limited, it still served for many countries to realize the importance of having an air force as a battle instrument. Like in the rest of the social strata during the National Socialist era, the Luftwaffe was sustained not only by its massiveness and technological power, but also by the ideological construction in the training of its pilots. Each tactic was also based on a racist and imperial ideology. Germany deserved Europe. It was its vital territory, and it had the authority to take it by force. Let's listen to the testimonies of a member of this force who recalls one of the most popular songs of that time.
Kamerad, Kamerad, der Befehl ist da, wir starten. Kamerad, Kamerad, alle Mädels müssen warten. Die Losung ist bekannt, ran an den Feind, Bomben auf England.
Por supuesto, eso estaba cada día en las noticias de las Fuerzas Armadas. Se oía esa canción de Inglaterra y así era como preparaban a la gente para que se preocupase realmente por aquello.
You have just heard the words of Horst Petschler, a distinguished pilot of the German Air Force, who achieved more than 20 victories aboard a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G10. Several decades have passed, but that song still resonates in his mind, seeking to ignite the spirits of young soldiers, already tired after a superhuman effort fighting against the Allies. The lyrics speak of abandoning women and vices and running towards the enemy, England. The British island was one of the primary objectives of the German aviation. There they unloaded hundreds of thousands of kilograms of explosives that devastated entire cities. But these types of offensives could not be carried out forever. There was a material and human limit that became increasingly apparent as France, the United States, and the Soviet Union surrounded Germany. During the final months of World War II, Luftwaffe pilots took to the skies in risky flights to counter Allied bombing raids on the heart of the Third Reich. Let us turn once again to the memoirs of pilot Petschler.
Siempre teníamos que despegar cuando venían al centro de Alemania y nos colocábamos delante de la formación de bombarderos. Evitábamos los ataques desde atrás porque eran demasiado costosos. Éramos probablemente 20 o 30 109s y Focke-Wulfs. Nos desplegábamos y nos lanzábamos y había piezas volando por todas partes. Veía paracaídas, veía aviones, cazas chocando con los bombarderos de lleno.
The scene Petschler describes is chaotic and desperate. In some ways, it resembles that recounted earlier by Schmitz. Towards the close of the war, disorganization took all German forces hostage, leading to reckless actions and the unnecessary deaths of thousands of young soldiers. Having failed to achieve victory over the Soviet Union in 1942, the Luftwaffe was embroiled in a great war of attrition that stretched to North Africa. With the entry of the United States into the war and the resurgence of the offensive power of the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom, the front on German soil, known as the Defense of the Reich, was created. The strength of the mythical institution was slowly eroded, and by mid-1944, it had practically disappeared from the skies of Western Europe, leaving the German army without support. More than any other force, the Luftwaffe was deeply involved in Nazi crimes and the extermination of tens of thousands of people. By the end of the war, a significant percentage of aircraft production originated in concentration camps, an industry that employed multitudes of prisoners. Lack of food and hard manual labor often resulted in the deaths of the victims. To put it in terms of numbers, in January 1944, Messerschmitt and its contractors used 7,564 slaves. The Heinkel industry and its subsidiaries had another 9,724, while Junkers used 1,571. Such a death factory could only be sustained with an ideological steel fist, which began to be sown from the early stages of the development of young Germans. This requires us to return to a topic that we have already explored in this video, but which we must learn more about: the Hitler Youth. What you just saw was the gigantic parade of the Hitler Youth in 1937. Tens of thousands of teenagers gathered to celebrate the ideology of National Socialism, receiving personal congratulations from the supreme leader of the movement. Within just 2 years, many of these children were already well-trained soldiers in the art of war, the backbone of the German armed forces. By 1945, many of these childish faces were buried in the ground. After 6 years of brutal fighting against the Allies. The importance of this ideological tool cannot be underestimated. These parades were the breeding ground for the most powerful military force of their generation, one driven by hatred and the desire to conquer. The time commitment and regular exposure to Nazi ideology weakened the influence of parents, teachers, religious figures, and other voices of authority. In fact, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls even encouraged their members to report to their leaders any suspicious behavior that occurred in their schools, churches, and families. The curious thing is that this gigantic mobilization of 1937 was not the first, but rather the high point of a tradition of several years. As we anticipated, the Hitler Youth was created in the mid-1920s, and every year about 2,000 boys had to march on foot from various points of Germany to the Nuremberg Congregation, one of the most important events of the National Socialist Party. Being invited to this parade was an honor, and every young German was prepared to sweat in the sun to arrive on time. As the Hitler Youth grew in number, so did the dispersion of institutions across the country. By the mid-1930s, there were factions that had to travel up to 800 kilometers to reach the meeting in Nuremberg, a distance that was covered on foot. Such a physical challenge had only one clear explanation. These children had to be prepared for war, and in war there is no room for compassion for weakness. All that matters is to carry out the orders that were assigned to them. When the boys grew up and were trained in various military trades, their officers and tutors recruited them for special forces according to their aptitudes and interests. As we told you previously, Gert Schmitz was taken to an airbase to be trained as a fighter pilot. This was one of the most prized roles, since fighting in the skies had an aura of mysticism incomparable to other institutions. The less fortunate were sent to the infantry, or here, the ground units of the Wehrmacht. During World War II, more than 13.5 million soldiers served in the Heer, of whom some 4 million died. At the same time, there was the Waffen-SS, a sort of elite commando force made up of up to 900,000 soldiers. Although both forces fought side by side, the Waffen-SS never belonged to the bulk of the ground troops. They were an autonomous and highly independent front. Let us listen to the words of a man who took part in the shootings of prisoners carried out by this elite commando force.
Mit denen konnten sie machen, was sie wollten. Versuchen Sie sich vorzustellen, da ist ein Graben, da stehen Menschen an einer Seite und dahinter stehen Soldaten, das waren wir, und die haben geschossen. Und die getroffen wurden, die sind runtergefallen.
Das, was Sie, während Sie geschossen haben, gedacht oder empfunden haben, das möchte ich, dass Sie mir das noch einmal sagen.
Nichts. Ich habe nur überlegt, Ziele vorsichtig.
His story is cold and painful, but also real. Everything we tell you about the ideological work of the Reich had a direct impact on the commitment of its troops to the murder of millions. Within the German forces, there were all kinds of soldiers. The convinced fanatics, those who were recruited out of obligation and fear, and even those who did not understand what they were doing. People who were swept away by the tide of history to become monsters in the service of one of the darkest leaders. Millions of deaths, a complete reconfiguration of Europe, and the discovery of crimes that were thought impossible within a modern society. The Second World War continues to be one of the most studied historical events. The wounds and scars obtained in that conflict continue to mark the present, so it is still essential to listen to the testimonies of those who lived through that hell. As time passes, the protagonists succumb to old age, but technology allows us to immortalize their memories as if they were first-person documentaries. This way, we come to the end of the video. If you like this content and want to continue learning fascinating stories about World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.